Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
It's actually kind of incredible. I don't think we've ever really talked about Tom Bombadil on this show until today. Isn't that kind of weird?
Not in detail. I think we made some passing comments, but it is strange given that he was at the time the movies came out, it was one of the biggest controversies because the whole Old Forest was removed, and of course Tom Bombadil's at the center of the Old Forest, and he's the one that saves them, and by whose grace they get those Cardolan blades, which then of course Mira uses to defeat the Witch King. So he's a real kind of pivot point in Tolkien from a storytelling perspective, but it was entirely missed out. We have mentioned, of course, that Jackson just took 6 chapters and threw it out the window. Yeah. And Tom Bombadil features heavily in 3 of those chapters. So.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us, when the films were coming out at theonering.com, knew that like those entire 6 chapters would be axed. Like it was all gone. Farmer Maggot was gone. Everything was gone.
Yep.
And so when we heard Tom Bombadil was gone, we're like, but wait, how are you going to have Old Man Willow? But wait, how are you going to have the Barrow Downs? But wait. And so there was an entire groundswell of like this bubbling, like a lava bubble coming up and about ready to explode. They're like, you're removing all of this? So it wasn't really Bombadil only. It was all the stuff that he's surrounded by that's being removed.
Your reference to a lava bubble, of course, makes me think of. I just want to be clear: not a Doritos laced lava bubble. No Doritos powder. This is a entirely different.
I'm so sorry I brought up that horrible memory for you. We do not talk about the Rings of Power's volcano, their magic steamy volcano.
Every time a volcano comes up now.
An angel gets its wings up. Oh my goodness. All right. So clearly we are talking about the removal of Tom Bombadil from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. And that's all we're going to be talking about this week, because I think that we might spend a little bit longer on this just because of that. But also, we're not going to be talking about like removing the Barrow Downs this time. We're going to make that a separate thing, because I think there's enough to talk about in that as a whole separate change. It's enough that happens there that's outside of Tom.
Tolkien puts it in an entirely different chapter. So
yeah, and so that will be next week. But today we're going to be talking about Tom Bombadil. We're going to actually be getting into. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion about who exactly is Tom Bombadil, but we're going to be doing that in our extended podcast, which you can get by going to theonering.com/member, become a member, become a sponsor. It's $4 a month. The first month is free, or you can go to Patreon and become a member there at theonering.com/Patreon. That one gets you 7 days free, and it's $5 a month, because Patreon takes more money.
More importantly than who Tom Bombadil is who is Yarwain Benedar.
Whoa.
Who is Forn.
Yeah. Wow, that came out of left field.
Who is Arald? Sorry, this is a joke. When they actually bring up at the Council of Elrond, they bring up the debate about whether they should give the ring to Bombadil. They bring up, of course, because it's Tolkien and it's all philology, they bring up what his names are by each of the races. So Yarwain Benedar is the elven name. Forn is I think it's the dwarven name, and
Tom Bombadil is the Dutch doll name.
Well, that's actually the Hobbit name, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about who is Tom Bombadil. We'll get into a little bit more actually in the book, The Return of the Shadow, which is the eighth book in Histories of Middle-earth. I think they part 1. I don't remember all the numbers. Anyway, there's a whole chapter about Tom Bombadil and the creation of it. It's chapter 6 in here, I think it is. Chapter 6, yeah. Tom Bombadil right there. And it talks about the very first conception that he have of Tom Bombadil. So we'll talk about that a little bit more too. And then we'll also see what some of our folks on Discord think about how Tom Bombadil should have been portrayed in the films, or if it's even possible. We'll get into that too. All right. I think that's it.
Let me jump in.
That's the whole intro. All right. So Tom Bombadil, we're calling this, sorry guys, we're calling this, "Hey doll, Mary doll, where's the dong dillo?" It's so funny. Sorry, every time. Okay.
Especially with an American accent.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Right. All right. So there's clearly no video of Tom Bombadil. There's no change. It's just a removal. And so like last week, we don't have anything here. So I thought I'd bring up a couple pictures of Tom Bombadil. This is Tom Bombadil's home, according to Alan Lee. Yeah. the little rainbow. It's this watercolor. There's even a little heron up there at the top. I guess I can use my mouse here to show you guys. A heron, a couple of doves. So anyway, and the water lilies, right? Because the first time, for instance, they meet Goldberry, she's got bowls with water lilies in them around her feet. And so he puts water lilies around here. I like that too. And then we have, let's see here. Next one, we have, this is John Howe's rendition of Tom Bombadil, perhaps an angrier Bombadil. I'll try and put these in the links below if you're listening, by the way, so you can click on these here.
Does that strike you as angry? That's interesting.
Well, I don't know. He's not. He's not smiling joyfully, because I think the picture that has become almost a meme for Bombadil is the picture by the Hildebrandt brothers, who have a more fantasy book cover version, 1980s fantasy book cover version of Tolkien, I guess maybe is the best way of putting it. Right. And that's this version of Bombadil.
Oh boy.
But he's got the he's got the feather in his hat.
So
the rest is kind of messed up.
Let's read the description Tolkien gives for the first time of Tom Bombadil.
All right, go for it.
Here we go. And this is after they hear his whole song, because of course the song comes before the person, because this is Tolkien. So he sings a whole song, and as he's traipsing through the old forest, and he hears their cries, and it says, there was another burst of song, and then suddenly, hopping and dancing along the path, there appeared above the reeds an old battered hat with a tall crown and a long blue feather stuck in the band. With another hop and a bound, there came into view a man, or so it seemed. At any rate, he was too large and too heavy for a hobbit, if not quite tall enough for one of the big people, though he made noise enough for one, stumping along with great yellow boots on his thick legs, and charging through grass and rushes like a cow going down to drink. He had a blue coat and a long brown beard. His eyes were blue and bright. His face was red as a ripe apple, but creased into 100 wrinkles of laughter. In his hands, he carried on a large leaf, as on a tray, a small pile of white water lilies. So you can see from this picture, as Jonathan said, definitely in the 80s fantasy style, but you can see from this picture that that they've basically created exactly what Tolkien described. Pretty much exactly. What I find funny about it is that when Tolkien says a thing like, he had a long blue coat and he had a blue coat and a long brown beard. When Tolkien says that, all they do is paint the blue coat. But this isn't a coat, right? This is a tunic of some kind, a long tunic. So what they're doing is they're like, we're just going to stick the text and paint just exactly what he says and no more. And so, of course, you get this incredibly garish blue versus yellow, which is, by the way, blue and yellow. It is a garish combination, no doubt there. Yeah. But basically, they've painted exactly and no more what Tolkien described, which I probably wouldn't have done if I was an artist and had talent, but I'm not, and I don't. So we'll go with that. But that's why I like John Howe's version better. I agree with you. He's a little more grim. Probably not. He's not depicted dancing. I always saw the John Howe picture that you had up before as like Bombadil heading over the Barrow Downs towards them when they were in need of rescue. And that's that. He has that sort of stern look on his face. Not angry. Nope. Not that one. Whatever the first one was.
I know. This is. But I thought this was a little bit slightly better rendition of Tom.
Yes. He actually has leggings and a waistcoat and other clothes besides just boots and a long tunic coat thing. Yeah. So in any case, he is definitely, without a doubt, seemingly discordant with the rest of what we've explained, what we've run into so far. There might be a touch of hobbitish culture about him. There might be a touch of the sort of the gay colors and the love of song, and obviously glorying in his woodland, which we find out later is his forest. He is the master of the old forest, and in the old forest in which he is the master, there are none that have power over him. Not even Sauron in the One Ring. But he's definitely an odd character.
Yeah. Well, let me read 2 quotes from Peter Jackson about why he decided not to put Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings, and then I'll read a quote from JRR Tolkien about what I think it's the longest quote he has where he talks about Bombadil. It's a letter in September 1954. All right, so this is what Peter Jackson said. I believe this is from a news article in 2001. In the plot of The Lord of the Rings, in our movie, in its most simple form, is Frodo carrying the ring. Eventually, he has to go to Mordor and destroy the ring. So, what does Old Man Willow contribute to the story of Frodo carrying the ring? What does Tom Bombadil ultimately really have to do with the ring? I know there's ring stuff in the Bombadil episode, but it's not really advancing our story. It's not really telling us things we need to know. Okay. And then his second quote, it was like, how he at least he thought about, like, how can we include Tom Bombadil? Like, is there a way we could have a nod to Bombadil in our film in the same way that they had a nod to Old Man Willow in The Two Towers, in Fangorn Forest rather than in the Old Forest? Here's what Jackson said. What we did contemplate, and it was really for the fans, was to have the hobbits walking through the Old Forest and to see a feathered cap come darting through the trees, to hear the sound of Tom Bombadil's voice and song, and then have the hobbits turn and run away as fast as they could. We thought that would acknowledge Tom Bombadil in an affectionate, joke kind of way, but we didn't have time to do it. And essentially, he's saying he's not advancing the story, so we can't put him in there, and we're already at 3 hours long. In an interesting, almost agreement with Peter Jackson, this is what Tolkien wrote. This is a long quote, so bear with me. This is what Tolkien wrote in a 1954 letter. You can see it in September 1954. Tom Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. I suppose he has some importance as a, quote, comment. I mean, I do not really write like that. He is just an invention who first appeared in the Oxford magazine about 1933. In fact, it was February 1934. And he represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. I would not, however, have left him in if he did not have some kind of function. I might put it this way. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power, and so on. But both sides, in some degree, conservative or destructive, want a measure of control. But if you have, as if it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounced control, and take your delight in things for themselves, without reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, then the question of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you, and the means of power quite valueless. It is a natural pacifist view which always arises in the mind when there is a war. But the view of Rivendell seems to be that it is an excellent thing to have represented, but that there are in fact things with which it cannot cope, and upon which its existence nonetheless depends. Ultimately, only the victory of the West will allow Bombadil to continue or even to survive. Nothing would be left for him in the world of Sauron. So Bombadil, to Tolkien, let's start at the very first phrase. He says he's not an important person to the narrative, which is exactly what Peter Jackson does. What he does add, he adds, of course, that depth to Middle-earth that we love. But he also adds the idea that, at least the way it sounds like this, right? That if you take delight in things for themselves without the reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, that the questions of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you, which is a dangerous place to be, in a sense, right? You can't, like, if you don't care about right and wrong, all you care is about what's right around you, then, they couldn't give the ring to Bombadil because he would just lose it. He wouldn't care about it. It doesn't matter to him. He doesn't have that sight about it. So anyway, That's how Tolkien thought of Bombadil.
That's a great quote from Tolkien, and what I found interesting, because I hadn't read that before from Tolkien, or if I have, I've forgotten it.
Yeah.
And but I did reread the passage about Bombadil in the Council of Elrond, when they're talking about potentially sending it to him. And so, from the mouth of Gandalf, and then subsequently from the mouth of Glorfindel, we get what Tolkien said. Actually, we get his own words from the letter, or at least a very clear concept. Gandalf points out that Bombadil, basically Arestor, hapless elf number 8, who Tolkien uses to he just rando elf in the council. we never hear from again. Gets the idea of, like, can't we wouldn't he take the ring, since the ring doesn't have any power over him, and keep it there forever harmless in his old forest? No, says Gandalf, not willingly. He might do so if all the free folk of the world begged him, but he would not understand the need. And if he were given the ring, he would soon forget it, or most likely throw it away. Such things have no hold on his mind. He would be a most unsafe guardian, and that alone is answer enough. And then Glorfindo goes on to point out, basically, he says, even if we could hide the fact that we transported it to the old forest, even if we could, soon or late, the Lord of the Rings would learn of its hiding place and would bend all his power towards it. Could that power be defied by Bombadil alone? I think not. I think that in the end, if all else is conquered, Bombadil will fall, last as he was first, and then night will come. Very poetic statement by Glorfindel. Because Bombadil, his name in Elvish, Iarwen Benedar, means literally oldest and fatherless. So he is the oldest and fatherless of the elves, think he is anyway, of the aspects of Middle Earth itself. So he neither cares about the ring, nor could he stand against Sauron, and he would fall in the end. Because as Tolkien points out, as in the letter you read, it requires folk that do care and are willing to oppose Sauron in order to give Bombadil the freedom that he has to exist. So he's an odd character, and I have an odd take on it. Maybe not. Maybe other people have said that, and I think. And I'm doing this because in juxtaposition, if you all haven't listened to our 6 episodes on fairy stories, we keep talking about them because they are foundational in Tolkien's thought to this kind of work. And I think very, very explicitly, or not explicitly in Tolkien's mind, because the way he writes is not that way. But I think when I was reflecting on what Bombadil is, I have landed on the idea that essentially Bombadil, more than anything else in Middle Earth that I have encountered, represents the Fae, the fairy. He represents fairy in Tolkien's mind. Fairy is an interesting thing because the rules of the real world don't apply to fairy. Fairy has its own set of rules, and we see that like the one rule about this entire story of the Lord of the Rings is that the ring will corrupt everyone, literally everyone, except Bombadil. So the rules don't apply to him, but the ring will corrupt even the best of the good folk of Middle Earth if given it, which is why they have to destroy it. So it's a tale of corruption. It corrupts the heart of Boromir. It eventually even corrupts Frodo, and he fails in the very end at the edge of the precipice in Mount Doom, and so it but Bombadil, not only doesn't it not affect him, but its effect on other people, like the invisibility that it conveys to Frodo, have no effect on him. He could see Frodo just fine, even with the ring on. So it has literally no power over Bombadil at all. And that aspect of him being outside the regular laws is very, very much Fae. His attitude is Fae. He cares about things deeply that other people see as trivial, and he holds trivial what other people see as the deepest and most serious elements of the world. Mm-hmm. He not everything, because he cares about the well-being of the hobbits and saves them from the Barrow-wights, for example, and saves them from Old Man Willow. So he cares about he's a good Fae spirit, but he is indeed Fae, and his concerns are not the concerns of this world. They're entirely different. And he reminds me of the the tales of the Fae in medieval literature and in the ancient traditions like the Celtic tradition and the French tradition and others, where there are these creatures that almost always their place, either where they live or where you access where they live, is in the woods, is in the wilds. And they have there's usually a hierarchy. They have a court, they're a king, and if Tom Bombadil is not king of the Old Forest, I don't know, by that word master, I don't know what is, and Goldberry is queen. There's just parallel after parallel for me of Tom Bombadil with that world of the Fae, and I think he's the most direct representation in Tolkien's work of fairy.
Tolkien I mean, even Tolkien calls him an enigma. He said that this is in that same letter. He said, even in the mythical age, there must be some enigmas, as there always are. Tom Bombadil is one intentionally.
Yeah.
And Fae is very enigmatic, right? Their motivations, their actions, and even here, like Frodo asks him, "Did you hear me calling, Master, or was it just chance that brought you at the moment?" And Bombadil says, "Did I hear you calling? Nay, I did not hear. I was busy singing. Just chance brought me then, if chance you call it. It was no plan of mine, though I was waiting for you. We heard news of you and learned that you were wandering. We guessed you'd come here down to the water. All paths lead that way down to the Withy Windle, etc., etc." So, so it was no plan. I was just waiting. What? And but it wasn't a plan. But I was waiting for you. So there's that same.
So it was chance, if chance you call it. Very
right.
Very Gandalf-like, right?
Gandalf,
So
yeah. So he's such a tough character. I mean, I can get why Peter Jackson did put him in, because you put him in, people would be like, "Wait, who's this guy?"
Yeah.
What? And he what? Who's this guy? And the funny thing is even in the Return of the Shadow here on the chapter on Tom Bombadil, where Tolkien first started writing Bombadil in 1938. So he started writing The Lord of the Rings in December 1937, and he got to this part at some point in 1938, writing Bombadil. And he has all these questions about Bombadil, and he talks about how, like, he's friends with Farmer Maggot, but maybe Farmer Maggot isn't even a hobbit or a human. He makes that little bit of a note. So he's not even sure where all that's coming from, but he's writing it down because that's the way that he writes. But I think I like the idea. I like your idea, right? He is that enigma. He is the Fae. He's not there to provide an answer to anything, but he's there to be, as Tolkien says, an adventure along the way out of something that Tolkien really loves.
Yeah, that's really true. And we remember from On Fairy Stories that Tolkien says that mystery and wonder are a necessary part of a good fairy story.
Yeah,
there must be a mystery. And Tom Bombadil is one of those, and he's probably the strongest example of that. Where even the master of the story, if you want to call it that, Tolkien himself never fully solidified his thought, or at least didn't up to the point where he left us any record of it, on who Bombadil was, what he was.
Yeah. I mean, Tolkien didn't know what he was. He never said, right? So this is where, and maybe we'll get into this more in our extended podcast at theoneword.com/member. This is where when people say, well, he was a Valar, he was this. No, Tolkien never explained anything about what Tom Bombadil really was. He never, ever, ever, ever put him into the cosmology of Middle-earth.
And what do you do with that in a movie?
Yeah, right. I don't know. Like, I think the only way to do that is, well, we'll get into it, but it's probably not doing it in a movie. And maybe there's another way to do it. But who would you get to act? Who did you get to be Tom Bombadil?
To me, I don't know how you felt when you read In the House of Tom Bombadil, that chapter. It feels almost like an old school fairy tale. It feels more like a less like an epic, like the rest of the story. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if Bombadil and the Old Forest are a story within a story, and the whole entry into the Old Forest, passing through, meeting Bombadil, going through the Barrow Downs, being saved by Bombadil, that itself is a sort of a mini story inside of Tolkien's larger story.
Yeah.
So should that take us to our analysis of what they did in the movie, or do you got more?
No. I mean, I've always got more about Bombadil, and I remember when I did the Babylon Bee podcast. This is right about where I started with them.
Oh, is that right?
Talking about it, and I know Kyle there. He loves Tom Bombadil. Was very disappointed that he wasn't in the films. Like, he is a huge Bombadil fan.
He would not
for what he represents.
He would not have loved Tom Bombadil if they had put him in the films.
That's a very aggressive response.
I'm sure of it, because Kyle really loves the work. I'm convinced that a lot of what we read in the Lord of the Rings books, and the reason we love what we read, is because of our imagination's relationship to the text, which is a very personal thing. Not that it can't be similar to other people's imaginative experience with the text, but it's never the same. And so I think Tom Bombadil is the most imaginative of all the characters, the most based in mystery and fairy, and so I think that the more you try to put him on screen, the worse it's. I just don't think he would have worked on screen.
Yeah, agreed. All right, let us then talk about the three questions that we do every single week. The first one is it lore friendly for this number 35? Hey doll, Mary doll, where's the dong dillo? Every time. I love that.
There will be no memes about this, none whatsoever.
Is it lore friendly to completely cut out Tom Bombadil?
You first.
Yeah, it is. I don't find that it changes the lore at all. Bombadil, like he said, and like Tolkien said, Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. So in that sense, he's not an important person to the lore of Middle Earth either.
Right. Well, there are many fun discussions going to be had about Tom Bombadil. This is probably the shortest question because obviously, yes, it is lore friendly. Tolkien himself said it, like the quote you just read. That he isn't actually a part of the story. He is an important part of the story. So removal of a non-important part would be lore friendly, since you have to remove parts in a movie.
All right. Next question: does the change make for better cinema in the films, not as a long-form TV show?
Yes,
it does.
Absolutely, it does. It would have been totally incomprehensible. People who had never read Lord of the Rings were already confused by so many new elements of his world and so much of the richness, and it had to be sort of explicitly explained or painfully explained sometimes by Jackson in his storytelling. They would have thought that Tom Bombadil was just like an acid trip or something.
Next one, there we go. How much do you like the change? How much do you like the change?
You first.
How much do I like the change? One, I think it would be really hard to find an actor to portray Bombadil. Two, I think that Bombadil is he's that bright reflection in the middle of a photograph that you did, like somehow it's kind of cool, but man, it just doesn't belong there, and so having him there, I think this is probably I think it's an inevitable change. So I'm going to go with a 4.3. Like the change was required to make the film comprehensible to people. Otherwise, too many questions about Bombadil. I mean, the amount of look up podcasts where people talking about who is Tom Bombadil, or just go to YouTube, like who is Tom Bombadil, and you'll find probably 1,000 videos about people talking about Tom Bombadil.
Yep, some people
because he's still no answer, and to have him in a film where there's no answer, and there'll never be an answer, you can never answer who Tom Bombadil is. It would have just been a problem.
There was actually a major position, not major, but like one of the positions that a lot of people took was that he was some form of like a wraith or like a Witch King variant or something. It was just.
Is
crazy.
This the Rings of Power you're talking
about?
No,
it isn't. It was long before the Rings of Power. So There are people that think that he was one of the Blue Wizards. There are people that think that he's, a Maiar, that he's Iru. That was a popular one. Everyone, some people thought, he's actually Iru Iluvatar, and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, especially because the elves name him fatherless and oldest, which, I mean, in an absolute metaphysical sense, who else would that apply to but Iru? But it turns out that that's not the sense that he's being talked about. Anyway, I go even higher than you. I am glad they did not take it. I am so happy they did not try. They would have failed. They would have crashed and burned so badly if they had tried to do Tom. I am extremely happy they didn't. They left him out because he does not deserve the treatment he would have received. 4.8.
Wow. 4.8. Wow. That's a strong word. You don't think there's really any possibility?
No. I saw what they did to Faramir. They would have butchered Tom Bombadil
and Aragorn.
Yeah, and Aragorn too. Yeah, all kinds of characters. Some of them they did well. Many of them they didn't. Bombadil is the most difficult character to get right, and they would have fallen on their face. And so I'm very happy they left him out.
And Arwen.
Don't even talk about it. We're not going to. I'm the rage machine in me is waiting for that moment because I have a 5-minute monologue which I'll probably cut down to 2 minutes. But
no, you never cut it down. Who are you kidding?
You're right. Maybe it's an 8-minute monologue. I'll cut down to 5 minutes.
Do you think this will be our highest rated change that we're okay with?
Probably.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
probably.
you're right.
I mean, there's some changes. Like I really like, and because I brought it up a number of times, it's just a tiny one. The sword fighting scene with Boromir and
Yeah.
the hobbits.
Yeah.
I think that's high fours as well, which we'll get to later. But because it's right, it's exactly in line. It's exactly the kind of thing that a filmmaker should do, which is in the spirit of what Tolkien and what easily could have happened on the trip. From Rivendell to Moria. So anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, wow. I'm not surprising though. Tom Bombadil, I think, will remain a controversial figure for as long as people read The Lord of the Rings. That much is 100% true.
But not angry controversial, just kind of fun, which is appropriate to Tom Bombadil. Do you hear a lot of people getting angry about Tom Bombadil? It's not really that big of a deal. He's just sort of fun to muse on. He lends himself.
I get angry about Tom Bombadil.
Well, we get angry about everything. So there's that.
No, you know what annoys me most is when people say like, well, in Tolkien's cosmology, Tom Bombadil would have been a Maiar, or would have been a Wraith, or would have been something like. People have a really hard time accepting what Tolkien said himself about Bombadil, that he is an enigma, and that you cannot put him in that box. Now, the closest thing you could say is he's a spirit outside of it, because let's just read what he says, what Tom Bombadil says about himself. And this is very similar to what Tolkien wrote the very first time he wrote Bombadil in 1938, that you can find in The Return of the Shadow. He writes this: "Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the barrow wights. When the elves passed westward," that would be when the elves were pulled along on an island over to Valinor. That's when the elves passed westward. So he was there before then. "He was here before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside," which is interesting. The O is capitalized, before the Dark Lord came from outside. So Tolkien put that in there. But so he's like, at the very least, he's some sort of.
You know what's great about that is that
spirit.
Most people will think that the Dark Lord means Sauron.
Yeah, and I know, right? It's not.
Nerds like us, like we know, like he's talking about Morgoth, and if Tom was there before Morgoth came from the outside, then he was there from the time that Eru formed Arda, and before all the Valar came to Arda. And so from the song of creation that Eru used to create Arda, Tom was there at the beginning. And so he's something different. He's not even he's some kind of spirit, I guess you could say, but he's not a Maiar, and he's not a Valar.
No, he's an intentional enigma, and that's okay, because there is something fantastical and wondrous about that, and I think we have to be okay with that.
And I love the fact that he just doesn't care. Like, he cares and he doesn't care, right? He cares deeply about saving the hobbits from inconvenience and death, but then he doesn't care about the ring.
Yeah.
And Sauron at all.
Oh, I thought you meant that Tolkien doesn't care what we think about Bombadil.
Oh, that's true too.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like, he addressed Bombadil in a couple of letters to people, but he probably got dozens, if not hundreds of people saying, like, who is Bombadil? What? Like, can you explain him? And then he wrote it down once, and he was done. He probably just like, I've said my piece to this one person.
Showing that I'm a more bitter man than Tolkien probably was. If I had written what he did and people were sending me letters, I would have special trash cans just for letters of certain types, and I would answer some of them, and then the rest I would just like, that's the Bombadil trash can.
Yeah.
Not going to do that.
It would be blue with a little yellow rim.
yellow bottom. Like that.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This was a fun discussion. Bombadil is clearly he's gonna be. People love him and people hate him. Both people who've seen the films and people who haven't. People who've read the books. They have a hard time doing it, but it's fun to talk about. So we appreciate your time. If you want to hear our extended podcast, which we'll talk about with perhaps what's the best way to portray Tom Bombadil. Who would be the actor to portray him? How do we imagine Tom Bombadil's songs? That's interesting. That's interesting. I have details. And would there be a better way to integrate Frodo's foreshadowing dreams into the film, rather if Bombadil wouldn't have been in it? So we'll get into those. So if you want to get that, go to theonering.com/member, become a member, $4 a month. Join us on Discord. You can even join us for free, you freeloaders, by clicking the link at the very top of the show notes below in YouTube or in your podcast app too. There's a Discord link where you can sign up for Discord. And yeah, next week we'll be doing at least probably the Barrow Downs and one more. I haven't figured out which one yet, but one more next week as well. So until then, we'll see you next week.
Goodbye, freeloaders.